Hey guys, tonight we begin with something you think you already know by heart, the 4th of July. That great red, white and blue blowout of grilled meat, warm potato salad, lawn chairs and fireworks you bought from a slightly suspicious tent in a parking lot. It is the one holiday where a grown adult will happily set fire to a small explosive in their own driveway and call it patriotism. But here is the quiet, slightly uncomfortable truth. Almost everything you have been told about that day is a little bit wrong. Wrong date, wrong signing, wrong bell, wrong flag, and possibly a wrong turkey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. These ideas from you are the whole reason this channel keeps growing, and I truly appreciate every single one. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always very late somewhere. We're also now on Spotify, so if you would rather drift off with just the audio, the link is in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered whether anyone actually signed anything on the 4th of July? Did the Liberty Bell really ring? Or is that just something a very confident teacher told you once? Did Betsy Ross exist? Or is she the historical equivalent of a story your grandmother swears is true? Was the whole country even in agreement? Or was there one guy in New York quietly muttering, "Let me get back to you on that"? And why do we celebrate a document by blowing up the sky? Congratulations, you've just woken up in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. It is hot, it is humid, the flies are enormous, and history is about to get a lot messier than the poster in your 3rd grade classroom. Let's start with the big one, the crack in the foundation of the entire holiday. The Continental Congress actually voted to break away from Britain on July 2nd, 1776, not the 4th. That was the real moment, the actual decision, the point of no return. The 4th was simply when they finished arguing over the wording of the announcement. So every year, on the wrong evening, you light a sparkler in honour of a vote that had already happened 2 days earlier. It is like celebrating your wedding anniversary on the day the invitations were printed. Picture the scene. It is the 2nd of July, the air in Philadelphia thick enough to chew, and inside a warm brick building a group of exhausted men has just done the single most dangerous thing of their lives. They have voted to commit treason against the most powerful empire on earth. This is the moment. This is the heartbeat. If there were ever a day to fire a cannon and weep into your waistcoat, it is right now. And what does the country do to honour this sacred instant? It ignores it completely and throws the party 2 days later. The confusion is not really anyone's fault, though. What happened on the 4th was that Congress formally adopted the final text, the polished wording of the Declaration itself, and because that document carries the date July 4th right there at the top, that is the date that stuck in everyone's memory. People remembered the paper, not the vote. The announcement outshone the decision, the way a wedding photo outshines the far less romantic moment someone actually signed the license at a courthouse. John Adams, who was there for all of it, believed to his bones that the 2nd of July was the date that would echo through history. He was so confident that he wrote it down, which we will get to. He imagined future generations celebrating that day with bonfires and bells. What he could not have imagined was that they would celebrate enthusiastically, wholeheartedly, and on the wrong afternoon, while he spun quietly in his grave like a rotisserie chicken of vindication. Think about how strange this is in modern terms. Imagine your company makes a massive decision on a Tuesday, the kind that changes everything, and then everyone agrees to celebrate on Thursday because that is when the press release got formatted. 2 days of your life quietly erased from the story simply because the paperwork looked better, with a later date on it. That is essentially what happened to July 2nd. It did the hard work, and July 4th took the credit and the fireworks. And here is the truly delicious part. None of this makes the holiday wrong exactly. The decision on the 2nd and the document on the 4th are two halves of the same event, like deciding to jump and then actually jumping. It is just that we chose to commemorate the paperwork rather than the plunge. We are, as a nation, celebrating the receipt instead of the purchase. So tonight, as you settle in, hold this gently in your mind. The freedom you associate with one specific summer evening was actually locked in 48 hours earlier by a room full of nervous men who had no idea which date you would eventually pick. They just knew they had done something they could never take back. The calendar, as usual, was an afterthought, and that little 2-day gap is only the first thread we're about to pull. John Adams was so certain about the date that he put it in writing, which is a bold move for anyone. In a letter to his wife Abigail, he predicted that July 2nd would be remembered forever with parades, games, bells, bonfires and illuminations across the land. He was right about the celebration and wrong about the day by a full 48 hours. Imagine being one of the smartest men in the room, correctly predicting fireworks 2 centuries in advance and still fumbling the date. Adams was essentially the first person to be annoyed about the 4th of July, and he never really got over it. Let's sit with the sheer confidence of this man for a moment. He does not hedge. He does not say the celebrations might land somewhere in early July, give or take. He names the day, the 2nd, and then describes the party in loving, specific detail, right down to the illuminations, which is the 18th century word for lighting things on fire in a festive rather than criminal way. He is basically writing a review of a holiday that will not exist for another year, and he is getting the vibe completely right and the date completely wrong. It is the kind of prediction that would be genuinely impressive if it were not so quietly tragic. He nailed the parades, he nailed the bonfires, he nailed the bells and the games and the general national tendency to celebrate freedom by making a lot of noise. He saw all of it coming, clear as day, decades and centuries into the future. And then the country looked at his beautifully accurate forecast, said thank you very much, and scheduled the whole thing 2 days after the date he circled. Imagine the modern equivalent. You send a text to your partner announcing that this coming Friday will be remembered as the greatest night of your lives, and you describe the entire evening in advance, the food, the music, the fireworks, everything. And then it all happens exactly as you said, gloriously, joyfully, perfectly, except on Sunday. You were right about everything except the one detail you are most sure of. That is Adams. That is his entire relationship with this holiday. And he knew. That is what makes it so wonderful. Adams lived for another 50 years after this letter, which meant he had 5 full decades to watch the nation celebrate on the 4th, while he privately insisted it should be the 2nd. He was the original well-actually guy at the party, standing slightly off to the side, arms crossed, muttering that everyone was doing it wrong. You almost certainly know someone exactly like this. There is a decent chance you are someone exactly like this. There is something deeply human in it, though. Adams was not wrong about what mattered. He understood better than almost anyone that this event deserved to be remembered with joy and light and a slightly unsafe amount of gunpowder. His only mistake was assuming the country would remember the moment of decision rather than the moment of announcement. He bet on substance. The nation bet on the headline. The nation won, as it usually does. So the next time you hear someone smugly correct a small factual detail while everyone else is simply enjoying themselves, spare a thought for John Adams, the founding father who saw the future with astonishing clarity and still got overruled by a piece of paper with a better date on it. He predicted your entire holiday. He just could not convince you when to have it. And honestly, that is the most relatable thing a founding father has ever done. Here is where the myth truly begins to unravel. You probably picture all the founders gathered around a table on the 4th, quill pens in hand, solemnly signing their names as sunlight streams through the window. That did not happen. On the 4th, Congress approved the text of the document. Most of the men did not put their signatures on the official copy until August 2nd, nearly a month later. The dramatic group signing you imagine is less a historical event and more a very persuasive oil painting. Let that settle for a second. The single most famous act of the American founding, the moment 56 brave men put their names on the line knowing it could get them hanged, did not happen on the day you celebrate it. It happened weeks afterward, in dribs and drabs, on a random Friday in August, when the weather was arguably even worse and nobody thought to make a painting of it. What actually happened on the 4th was procedural and, frankly, a little dull. Congress adopted the wording. They agreed the text was final. That was the vote. There was no grand ceremonial lineup, no orchestral swell, no beam of divine light illuminating a quill. There was mostly relief, exhaustion, and the pressing question of how quickly they could get the thing printed and distributed before the whole endeavour got them killed. The signing, the real one, the pen-to-parchment moment, came later, once a proper handwritten copy had been carefully prepared. On the 2nd of August, the delegates who were around began adding their signatures to that formal version. And even then, it was not everyone at once. It was a trickle, a slow procession of men stopping by to make it official whenever they could manage it. Think about what this does to the image in your head. The one where they're all there together, shoulder to shoulder, a band of brothers united in a single heroic instant. It is a beautiful picture. It is also essentially a dramatization, the historical equivalent of a movie that opens with the words based on a true story and then invents most of the good parts. The truth is more like a shared document that people signed as they got around to it, which anyone who has ever chased down co-workers for signatures will recognize immediately. Here is a modern comparison that hurts a little. Imagine your entire team makes a huge decision in a meeting on Monday. Everyone agrees, the decision is locked, it is real. But the actual contract does not get signed until weeks later, and even then people sign it one at a time whenever they wander past the front desk. Nobody frames that. Nobody paints that. And yet that is precisely how the founding document of a nation actually got its signatures. None of this makes the men any less brave, mind you. Putting your name on a treasonous document is a staggering act of nerve no matter what day you do it. The point is simply that the crisp cinematic version, the one with the sunlight and the solemn simultaneous signing, is a story we told ourselves afterward because it felt right. Reality was messier, slower, and spread across a calendar. So the image you inherited is not a lie so much as a compression. A whole month of scattered signatures squeezed into one imaginary golden afternoon. And once you know that, the next detail becomes almost inevitable, because that heroic signing ceremony you pictured was even looser and stranger than a single wrong date could ever suggest. Even that August signing was not the tidy cinematic moment you have in your head. Delegates wandered in and added their names over a stretch of weeks, some of them long after the 2nd, whenever they happened to be in town and had a free moment. A few signers were not even present for the original vote. It was less a sacred ceremony and more a very slow office birthday card, passed around the building until everyone had scribbled something on it. So we've already dismantled the idea of a signing on the 4th. Now let's dismantle the idea of a single grand signing at all. Because the beautiful mental picture of 56 men queuing up in dignified silence on one momentous day is, unfortunately, also fiction. What really happened was closer to a document sitting quietly in a room while various founders drifted past over the course of weeks, adding their signatures as their schedules allowed. The main event was the 2nd of August. Yes, but that was more of a starting point than a finish line. Some men signed then, others signed later, whenever business or travel finally brought them back to Philadelphia. The parchment simply waited, patient and treasonous, for each delegate to get around to it. If you have ever left a card on the breakroom table for someone to sign and watched it slowly gather signatures over a fortnight, you have witnessed a faint echo of how a nation was founded. And here is a genuinely strange wrinkle. Some of the men whose names appear on the Declaration were not even present when independence was actually voted on. They arrived on the scene afterward, joined Congress, and still ended up signing the document, cementing their place in history for a decision they were not technically in the room for. It is a bit like adding your name to a group project you joined in the final week, and then being listed as a founding contributor forever. Meanwhile, at least one man who was there and voted enthusiastically for independence never got his signature onto the famous parchment at all, for various tangled reasons of timing and circumstance. So the roster of signers is not a clean snapshot of who made the decision. It is a slightly lopsided collection of who happened to be available with a pen in hand during a rather elastic window of time. Picture the modern version. A momentous company-wide decision is made. To commemorate it, someone prepares a beautiful certificate for everyone to sign. But people are busy, so it just lives on a desk. Karen from the meeting signs it 3 weeks late. Dave, who joined the company after the decision, signs it anyway because he was standing right there. And poor Steve, who argued passionately for the whole thing, somehow never signs it at all and spends the rest of his life mildly annoyed about it. That is roughly the energy of the actual signing. Not a thunderclap of unified courage, but a long, quiet administrative process punctuated by great personal risk. Because make no mistake, every single signature was still an act of extraordinary bravery. These men were writing their names on a document that named them as traitors to the crown. The danger was real whether you signed it in a dramatic ceremony or on your way to lunch 3 weeks later. It is just that history prefers the clean version, the one moment, the shared breath, the single heroic act. The truth was slower and more human, and, in its own scattered way, arguably more impressive, because these men committed treason not in one adrenaline-fueled instant, but calmly, deliberately, over weeks, knowing exactly what they were doing each time they picked up the pen. And the painting that supposedly captures all this, that is its own delightful problem. You know the painting. The one on the back of the $2 bill, the one printed in every textbook, the grand scene of the founders assembled in a stately room. Most people assume it shows the signing of the Declaration. It does not. It shows the drafting committee presenting their work to Congress, an entirely different and far less exciting moment. So the single most famous image of American independence is technically a picture of a group of men handing in their homework. This one is a personal favourite because the painting is so iconic and so misunderstood that it has essentially fooled an entire nation for generations. You've seen it 1,000 times. The dignified room, the founders arranged in solemn clusters, the little group standing at the front. Everything about it screams historic signing, and it is showing you something else entirely. The painting depicts the moment the drafting committee, the 5 men tasked with producing the document, presents the draft to the Continental Congress. That is it. It is the hand-in, the submission, the equivalent of walking up to the front of the class and placing your assignment on the teacher's desk. Nobody in that image is signing anything. They're turning in their work and awaiting feedback, which, as we established, was going to be brutal. The artist, who painted this decades after the fact, was not trying to deceive anyone. He was capturing an important moment in the process. But because the scene looked so ceremonial, so weighty, so obviously significant, people took one glance and decided it must be the signing. And once that assumption locked in, it never left. The image became shorthand for a thing it does not actually show, like assuming a photo of someone holding a trophy must be the moment they won, when really they are just posing for the newspaper afterward. So consider the layers of irony here. The most recognizable painting of American independence, reproduced endlessly, printed on currency, hung in classrooms, is a picture of a committee submitting a first draft that was about to be aggressively edited by a room full of critics. It is not the triumph. It is the nervous moment right before the triumph, when the authors handed over their work and everyone else got ready to tear into it. The modern parallel is almost too perfect. Imagine the most famous photograph of a huge project in your company's history. Everyone treats it as the celebratory image, the big win, the moment of glory. And then someone points out that it is actually a photo of the team presenting the rough draft in the meeting, where leadership decided to cut a quarter of it. Suddenly the heroic photo becomes something much more relatable and much more stressful. And yet the painting endures, precisely because it feels correct. It has the right mood, the right gravity, the right sense of occasion. It just happens to be capturing the wrong occasion. This is a running theme, if you've not noticed. Again and again, the version of the founding we carry in our heads is the emotionally satisfying one rather than the literally accurate one. We remember the feeling and quietly discard the facts. So the next time you glimpse that scene, on a $2 bill or a classroom wall, enjoy it for what it truly is. Not the signing, not the final triumph. A group of exhausted, brilliant, deeply nervous men submitting their homework to a committee that was about to mark it up in red ink. Which brings us neatly to the man who wrote the homework and had to sit there while everyone corrected it. Jefferson gets the credit, and he did produce the first draft, hunched over a portable writing desk in a rented room, sweating through a Philadelphia summer. But the idea of him as the lone genius author is generous at best. He was part of a committee of 5, and once he was done, Congress got hold of the text and did what committees always do. They edited it, aggressively. Jefferson sat through the whole thing looking, by most accounts, deeply wounded, like a man watching strangers rearrange his furniture. Let's give Jefferson his due first, because he did do the heavy lifting. He was the one who sat down in a rented room at his clever little folding writing desk and actually produced the words. In the sticky heat of a Philadelphia June, while flies committed their own act of aggression against his ankles, he drafted the document that would become the Declaration. That is real, and it is impressive, and it is why his name is the one you remember. But the popular image of Jefferson as a solitary genius, channeling the entire spirit of a nation through one inspired pen, needs a little air let out of it. He was not working alone. He was one of 5 men appointed to a committee for exactly this purpose, a group that included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, both of whom had thoughts, because Franklin and Adams always had thoughts. Jefferson was chosen to write the draft in part because the others were busy, and in part because he had a reputation for good prose. He was, essentially, the guy the group project got assigned to, and then came the part every writer dreads. Once Jefferson finished his draft, it did not float up to heaven as a perfect, untouchable text. It went to the committee and then to the full Congress, where dozens of men proceeded to do to it exactly what dozens of men always do to a piece of writing. They picked at it. They questioned word choices. They removed passages. They softened lines. They debated phrasing with the enthusiasm of people who have strong opinions and a lot of time. Jefferson, by every account, hated this. He sat there, quietly seething, watching his careful sentences get sanded down and rearranged by a committee. For a writer, this is a uniquely specific agony. It is not the pain of rejection. It is the slower, more maddening pain of watching people improve, or worse, alter your work in front of you while you're powerless to stop them. Every crossed-out line was a tiny wound. He was a man watching strangers walk into his home and casually move all the furniture 6 inches to the left. If you have ever submitted anything, a report, an email, a carefully worded message, and watched a group of people revise it in real time, you know precisely how he felt. There is nothing quite like defending a sentence you love to a room that has already decided it is leaving. And Jefferson had to endure this not for a memo, but for the founding document of a country, which somehow makes it both more important and more painful. The truth, though, is that the collaboration probably helped. The editing tightened things. The committee structure meant the document was not one man's voice, but distilled expression of a shared cause. Jefferson supplied the soaring language, and the group supplied the ruthless trimming, and between them they produced something stronger than any of them would have alone. That is how good work often happens, however much the original author wants to lie down on the floor about it. So yes, Jefferson wrote it. But he wrote it inside a machine of collaboration and critique that shaped every line. And the single most painful cut of all, the one that still stings across the centuries, is where we are headed next. The version you know is not the version Jefferson handed in. The delegates slashed roughly 1/4 of his original words, trimming, softening and rewording as they went. Jefferson considered many of these changes to be butchery. Benjamin Franklin, sitting beside him, reportedly tried to comfort him with a long, gentle story to distract him from the pain. It may be the earliest recorded example of a co-worker saying honestly, the edits made it stronger, while the author quietly seethed. 1/4. Sit with that number for a moment. Congress took Jefferson's draft and removed close to 25% of it. That is not a light edit. That is not a few tweaks for clarity. That is a substantial chunk of a man's carefully constructed argument, lifted out and set aside while he watched. If you have ever had a piece of writing cut by a fraction of that and felt the sting, imagine losing a full 1/4 of it in a public room full of your peers. The cuts were not random, of course. The delegates had reasons, political and practical, for everything they removed and softened. They were trying to produce a document that 13 wildly different colonies could actually agree on, which meant sanding away anything too sharp, too risky, or too likely to sink the fragile consensus. Every deletion was a negotiation. Every softened phrase was someone somewhere being kept on board. It was diplomacy performed with an eraser. Jefferson, however, did not experience it as diplomacy. He experienced it as vandalism. To him, these were not helpful refinements. They were wounds inflicted on a text he had laboured over, each one diminishing what he had built. He kept his own copy of the original, the unbutchered version, and he made sure people could see exactly what had been changed, which is the 18th century equivalent of keeping the receipts and showing them to anyone who will look. He wanted history to know what his draft had said before the committee got to it. And this is where Benjamin Franklin enters in what might be the most quietly hilarious act of workplace kindness ever recorded. Franklin, sitting beside the visibly suffering Jefferson, saw a young man in pain watching his work get dismantled. So Franklin did what a good, wise older colleague does. He leaned over and told him a long, meandering, gentle little story designed entirely to distract Jefferson from the ongoing dissection of his prose. It was comfort disguised as an anecdote, a verbal hand on the shoulder. There is something so deeply human in that image. The great Benjamin Franklin, elder statesman, scientist, diplomat, essentially patting a wounded writer on the head with a soothing tale so he would stop watching the carnage. anyone who has ever had a kind co-worker pull them aside during a rough meeting and murmur, "It is going to be fine," do not look at the comments, knows exactly what Franklin was doing. He was running interference on Jefferson's ego, and gently at that. The modern version writes itself. You pour your heart into something, you submit it, and then you have to sit in the meeting while people cut a quarter of it out in front of you. And the only thing keeping you from combusting is the colleague beside you, quietly telling you a story about their weekend to keep you from watching your best paragraph get deleted. That, apparently, is how a nation edits its founding document. Here is the twist, though. Most historians agree the edits genuinely did make it tighter and stronger. The trimmed version was leaner and more powerful, which means Jefferson was suffering through improvements, the most infuriating kind of suffering there is. And of all the passages that fell to the editing knife, one in particular stands out, both for what it said and for the enormous shadow its removal would cast. One of the most striking cuts was a lengthy passage in which Jefferson, himself an enslaver, blamed the king for the slave trade. It was removed before the final approval, struck out to keep certain colonies on board. This is one of the great uncomfortable footnotes of the founding, a contradiction baked directly into the document from the very first draft. It is a detail that rarely makes it onto a paper plate covered in barbecue sauce, and yet there it is. This is the moment in tonight's journey where the tone shifts, and rightly so, because this particular cut is not funny. It is one of the deepest and most painful contradictions in the entire founding, and it deserves to be looked at plainly. In his original draft, Jefferson included a long passage attacking the slave trade, laying the blame for it at the feet of the king. It was fiery, it was lengthy, and it was one of the strongest sections he wrote, and it was removed, struck out entirely before the document was approved. The reason was coldly practical. Certain colonies, whose economies were bound up in slavery, would not accept a founding document that condemned the institution, and the fragile unity of the moment depended on their agreement. So the passage was sacrificed to preserve the coalition. Consensus was bought at the cost of confronting the single greatest moral failing of the era. The contradiction here is staggering, and it does not resolve neatly. Jefferson wrote a passage condemning the slave trade while himself enslaving other human beings. He blamed the king for a system he personally participated in and profited from. There is no way to make that clean. It is a knot of hypocrisy and moral blindness sitting right at the origin of the nation, present from the very first draft, and it cannot be smoothed over or explained away. What makes it even heavier is that the document these same men were producing would go on to declare that all men are created equal. That phrase survived. The passage against the slave trade did not. So the founding text ended up proclaiming a universal ideal of equality, while quietly removing the one section that grappled, however imperfectly and self-servingly, with the most obvious violation of that ideal. The word stayed. The reckoning was cut. This is the kind of detail that gets left out of the comfortable version of the story, the version with the fireworks and the potato salad, and the cheerful certainty. And it should not be left out. Because the people this affected were real, and the consequences of that deletion echoed for generations, through lives and families and centuries of struggle that followed. A single editorial choice in a warm room in 1776 reflected a nation choosing unity over justice, and the country would spend a very long time paying for that choice. It is worth pausing here, quietly, without a joke to soften it. The founding was an act of genuine courage and genuine vision, and it was also, from the very beginning, entangled in a profound and unresolved injustice. Both things are true at once. The same document that inspired movements for freedom around the world was written and approved by men who, in many cases, held human beings in bondage. That tension did not appear later. It was there in the original text, and then it was edited out. So as you drift tonight, hold this one a little differently than the rest. Not with a smile, but with honesty. The story of the 4th is not only fireworks and myths and charming errors, it is also this, a deleted passage and a contradiction that shaped everything that came after. And speaking of things that were not quite as unanimous as the legend suggests, the vote itself had a rather conspicuous holdout. You imagine 13 colonies rising as one, united in glorious agreement. In reality, when the vote came, New York simply sat there. Its delegates had not received permission from home, so they politely abstained, essentially raising a hand and saying, "We would rather not commit right now." New York did not get around to approving independence until July 9th, a full week later, proving that even in 1776 someone was leaving you on red. The grand image is of 13 colonies standing shoulder to shoulder, a perfect unbroken line of united resolve, all declaring independence together in one triumphant chorus. It is stirring. It is also not quite what happened. When the actual vote for independence took place, it was not a clean sweep of 13 enthusiastic yeses, it was 12. Because New York, in a move of magnificent bureaucratic caution, declined to vote at all. This was not defiance exactly. New York's delegates were not opposed to independence. Their problem was procedural and deeply relatable. They had not received updated instructions from their government back home, and they did not feel authorized to commit their entire colony to treason without permission. So rather than vote yes or no, they simply abstained. They sat on their hands. They kicked the single most important decision in colonial history down the road, because they were waiting to hear back from management. Think about the restraint required to sit in that room, feel the weight of the moment, watch the other colonies commit to the boldest act imaginable, and still say, respectfully, "We are going to need to check with the Home Office first." Everyone else is leaping off the cliff into revolution, and New York is standing at the edge going, "Hold on, let me confirm we are actually allowed to do this." It is the most bureaucratic response possible to a genuinely world-changing event. New York finally got around to approving independence on July 9th, a full week after everyone else had already committed. A week. In modern terms, this is the group chat where the plan is made, everyone enthusiastically agrees, the event actually happens, and then one person surfaces days later with a thumbs up and a "we are in, sorry, just saw this." New York left the entire revolution on read, and then replied once the moment had comfortably passed. And honestly, there is something almost endearing about it. New York was not being cowardly. It was being careful, procedurally responsible, unwilling to make an enormous decision without proper authorization. In any other context, this would be considered admirable diligence. It just happens that the context here was the founding of a nation, where diligence looked an awful lot like showing up to the party after the cake was gone. The larger point matters, though, because it punctures the myth of instant total unity. The colonies were not a single mind moving in perfect harmony. They were 13 separate, squabbling, cautious, self-interested entities, each with its own politics, its own hesitations, and its own home government to answer to. Getting even 12 of them to agree on the same day was a minor miracle of persuasion. The 13th needed a week and a permission slip, so the next time you picture the founding as a seamless act of collective will, remember New York, sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for clearance while history happened without it. Unity, it turns out, was more of a rolling process than a single glorious instant, and the announcement of that not quite unanimous decision reached the public in a way that also scrambles the neat timeline you were taught, because the document went to the printer before anyone stood up and read it aloud. After the text was approved, it was rushed to a printer named John Dunlap, who worked through the night to produce copies known today as the Dunlap broadsides. These printed sheets, not the fancy handwritten version, were the first copies to travel out into the world. The public did not actually hear the declaration read aloud in Philadelphia until July 8th. So the big announcement to the people happened 4 days after the date now stamped on every calendar. Here is a detail that quietly rearranges the whole sequence in your head. When you imagine the declaration going out to the world, you probably picture that beautiful, ornate, handwritten parchment, the one with the elegant script and the famous signatures. But that was not what spread the news. The version that actually travelled, the one that reached towns and taverns and troops, was a plain printed sheet, cranked out on a press in a hurry. The man responsible was a printer named John Dunlap, and on the night after the text was approved, he did what printers do in a crisis. He worked through the night. While the founders presumably went to get some well-earned and deeply nervous sleep, Dunlap was in his shop, setting type by candlelight, producing copies of the most explosive document in the colonies. These printed sheets are known today as the Dunlap broadsides, and they were the real vehicle of the news, the version that carried the word outward into the world. There is something wonderful about the fact that the founding document reached the public not as a sacred handwritten relic, but as a rush job from an overnight print run. No gold leaf, no calligraphy, just ink on paper, produced fast because speed mattered more than beauty. The famous fancy version, the one everyone lines up to see in a glass case, came later. The version that actually did the job was the humble printed one, made by a working man pulling an all-nighter. And then there is the timing of when people actually heard it. You might assume the declaration was read aloud to cheering crowds on the 4th itself, the moment it was approved. It was not. The first public reading in Philadelphia did not happen until July 8th, 4 full days after the date now printed on every calendar and celebrated with every firework. For 4 days the great announcement existed mostly on paper, travelling and printing before the public in Philadelphia actually stood in a square and heard the words spoken. Picture the modern equivalent. The huge decision is made on a Thursday. The official document is finalised. But the actual public announcement, the moment everyone gathers to hear it read out loud, does not happen until the following Monday. In between, the news is quietly circulating in printed form while the formal reveal waits for the right moment. It is a launch with a 4-day gap between the paperwork and the press conference. This gap, once you see it, dissolves the tidy image of everything happening at once on one magical day. The vote was on the 2nd. The text was approved on the 4th. The printing happened overnight after that. The public reading came on the 8th. The signatures trickled in through August. The whole thing was a process stretched across weeks, not a single thunderclap of a moment. We simply chose one date, the one printed at the top of the page, and pinned the entire story to it. So when you picture that first announcement, swap out the golden parchment for a stack of fresh printed sheets, still smelling of the ink, produced by a tired man named Dunlap who worked all night so a nation could read the news. That is the real image, less majestic, more human, and far more true to how history actually moves, one hurried, imperfect, deeply necessary step at a time. Ah, the Liberty Bell ringing out triumphantly across Philadelphia to announce freedom to a cheering crowd. It is a beautiful image. It is also almost certainly made up. There is no solid evidence the bell rang for independence at all, and the steeple it hung in was reportedly in such poor condition that ringing it might have been unwise. The stirring scene you picture was popularized by a writer decades later who, frankly, understood that a good story beats a boring truth every time. Close your eyes and you can practically hear it. The great bell swinging in its tower, booming out over the rooftops of Philadelphia, calling the people into the streets to learn that a nation had been born. Church bells answering from every direction. crowds weeping and cheering in the summer heat. It is one of the most cinematic images in the entire American origin story, and there is almost nothing behind it. Historians have looked and looked hard for any reliable contemporary record of the Liberty Bell ringing specifically to mark independence, and they keep coming up empty. There is no solid first-hand account from the time describing that famous peal. It is not that someone proved the bell stayed silent. It is that the dramatic ringing you have always imagined simply does not appear in the trustworthy records, which is a very different thing from being an established fact. There is also a rather practical problem, which is the condition of the tower itself. By the accounts that survive, the wooden steeple housing the bell was in a sorry state, aged and decaying to the point where enthusiastically swinging a massive bronze bell inside it might not have been the wisest structural decision. Ringing it hard could have been an invitation for something heavy to come crashing down, hardly the triumphant image you were sold in grade school. So where did the beloved scene come from, if not from history? It came, as these things so often do, from a storyteller. Decades after the fact, a writer crafted the vivid tale of the bell pealing out for freedom, and it was so satisfying, so perfectly shaped, that people simply adopted it as truth. It filled an emotional need. The founding deserved a soundtrack, and a booming bell was a far better soundtrack than the actual quieter reality of printed sheets and delayed public readings. This is one of those cases where you can see exactly why the myth won. A good story is sticky. It lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. The truth that the announcement spread mostly through printed broadsides and was read aloud several days late in a square is accurate but undramatic. The image of a great bell ringing out liberty is thrilling. Given the choice, human memory grabs the thrilling one every single time and never looks back. Think of the modern version. Some enormous event happens at your company, and years later everyone remembers the big dramatic all-hands moment, the standing ovation, the emotional speech. Except it did not happen that way. The real news went out in a plain email that most people skimmed on their phones, but the memory of the grand moment feels so much better that it quietly overwrites the boring truth, and soon everyone is nostalgic for a scene that never occurred. None of this makes the bell any less meaningful, of course. It became a genuine and powerful symbol, just not on the day, and not in the way you were taught. Its real story is stranger and more interesting than the myth. And the man most responsible for the ringing legend deserves a proper introduction, because he was not a historian at all. He was, of all things, a novelist. The dramatic tale of the bell ringing on the 4th was largely invented by a writer named George Lippard in the 1840s, published in a collection of patriotic fiction. He added an old bell ringer and a young boy shouting the signal, and the public adored it so much that it quietly slid from storybook to accepted history. It is the historical version of a rumour that becomes fact simply because everyone enjoyed repeating it. Let's meet the culprit. His name was George Lippard, and he was a popular writer in the 1840s, a spinner of dramatic, sentimental, crowd-pleasing tales. He was not attempting to document history with careful accuracy. He was doing something much more entertaining. He was writing patriotic legends, the kind of stirring stories that make readers feel the swell of national pride, and he published them fully understanding that they were embellished, romantic, and often invented. His version of the Liberty Bell story is a masterpiece of manufactured drama. In it, an aged bell ringer waits anxiously in the tower, unsure whether independence will actually be declared. Down below, a young boy stands watching for the signal, and when the moment finally comes, the boy shouts up to the old man to ring, ring, and the bell peals out in glorious triumph. It is vivid, it is emotional, it has a child in it, which is basically cheating, and it is essentially a short story. But here is the thing about a really good invented scene. If it is satisfying enough, people stop caring where it came from. Lippard's tale was so beloved, so perfectly shaped to what people wanted the founding to feel like, that it detached from its author and floated off into the culture as though it had always been true. Readers repeated it. Teachers taught it. It migrated from the fiction shelf to the history shelf without anyone checking its papers at the border. This is how a great many myths become facts, not through deception, but through delight. Nobody sat down and decided to lie to future generations. It is simply that Lippard's story was more fun to tell than the truth, so it got told more often, and repetition is the engine that turns fiction into folklore. Say a satisfying thing enough times to enough people, and eventually it hardens into something that feels like established knowledge. You have watched this happen in your own life, almost certainly. Some story gets told at family gatherings, a tale about a relative, an event, a wild coincidence. It gets a little more polished each time. The details sharpen, the drama heightens, and after a couple of decades nobody can say for sure which parts actually happened. The story has become truer than the truth, purely because everyone enjoys telling it. Lippard's Bell is exactly that, scaled up to the size of a nation. There is no villain here, which is what makes it so charming. Lippard was doing his job as a writer of patriotic fiction. The public did what publics do, and embraced the version that felt best. The result is that one of the most iconic images of American independence originated in a storybook, written decades after the fact, by a man who would probably be delighted to learn how thoroughly his invention conquered reality. So the ringing bell you picture is real, in the sense that a beloved character is real. It lives vividly in the collective imagination, it means something, and it just was not there on the day itself. And the bell has one more surprise for us, because even its famous name, the Liberty Bell, did not exist for decades after the founding it supposedly celebrated. For most of its early life, the bell did not even have its famous name. It was just the State House bell, a large, functional, occasionally cracked hunk of metal. It only became the Liberty Bell in the 1830s, when abolitionists adopted it as a symbol for their cause, drawn to the inscription about proclaiming liberty. So the beloved icon of 1776 actually got its identity from a completely different struggle, decades after independence. Here is a small shock. The name Liberty Bell, the one that feels as old and permanent as the founding itself, did not exist during the Revolution. In 1776, nobody was calling it that. It was simply the State House bell, a big, useful object that hung in the Pennsylvania State House and did the ordinary work bells do, summoning people to gather, marking occasions, making noise when noise was required. It had a job, not a legend. For decades, that is all it was, a functional piece of civic equipment with a somewhat troubled history of cracking and being recast, which we will get to. It was not an icon. It was not a shrine. It was a tool, respected in the way you might respect a reliable town clock, but certainly not treated as a sacred relic of national birth. The reverence came much later, and from an unexpected direction. The transformation happened in the 1830s, and it had nothing to do with the events of 1776. It came from the movement to abolish slavery. Abolitionists searching for powerful symbols noticed the inscription cast into the bell itself, a biblical line about proclaiming liberty throughout the land. That phrase struck them as perfect, a ready-made emblem for their cause, and they seized on it, adopting the bell as a symbol of the freedom they were fighting to extend to enslaved people. It was these abolitionists who gave the bell its famous name. In their writings and their imagery, the old State House bell became the Liberty Bell, recast not in bronze this time, but in meaning. They looked at that inscription, at that call to proclaim liberty, and they pointed out the searing contradiction of a nation that displayed such words while holding millions in bondage. The bell became a tool of moral argument, its message turned toward a struggle its makers had never imagined. So consider the full journey. An ordinary State House bell, present but probably not ringing in triumph in 1776, its dramatic peal invented by a novelist decades afterward, and its very name bestowed not by the founders but by abolitionists in the 1830s, who repurposed it for an entirely different fight for freedom. The icon you associate so tightly with the 4th of July was actually named in service of the movement to end slavery, the very injustice that a deleted passage in the Declaration had failed to confront. There is a strange and fitting justice in that. The bell became a symbol of liberty most powerfully in the hands of people demanding liberty for those the founding had left out. Its meaning grew larger and truer over time, shaped by later generations who saw in it something the original owners never intended. The bell we revere is, in a real sense, a creation of the 19th century as much as the 18th. It is a good reminder that symbols are not fixed. They get adopted, renamed, and repurposed by whoever needs them most. The Liberty Bell earned its name long after independence, in a struggle the founders never fully faced. And speaking of that troubled physical history, the famous crack running through it has a story every bit as tangled as its name. Everyone knows the bell is cracked. Almost no one agrees on how or when. The tidy legend that it cracked while ringing for independence is, predictably, not supported by the facts. The famous crack most likely developed in the 1800s and was made worse by an attempted repair. The bell you revere is essentially a very old object with a very confusing medical history and a lot of conflicting witness statements. The crack is the bell's defining feature. It is the thing every child draws, the detail that makes the object instantly recognizable. And yet, if you go looking for a clean, agreed-upon story of how that crack happened, you will find yourself lost in a swamp of competing accounts, vague dates, and legends that do not hold together. The one thing everyone knows about the Liberty Bell turns out to be the thing nobody can actually explain with confidence. Let's dispose of the most satisfying version first. There's a romantic notion that the bell cracked in that very moment of triumph, ringing so hard for independence that it split under the strain of its own joy. It is a lovely image, freedom itself so powerful it broke the bell. It is also, like the ringing legend it depends on, unsupported by reliable evidence. If the bell did not dramatically ring for independence in the first place, it obviously did not dramatically crack while doing so. The truer picture is messier and far less poetic. This particular bell had a troubled life from early on. It had a history of cracking that predated the revolution entirely, and it was recast more than once by local metalworkers trying to get it right. So the object had structural drama baked into it long before it became a national symbol. It was frankly a bit of a problem bell, prone to trouble in the way some objects just are. The famous crack, the big one you picture, most likely developed in the 1800s, well after the founding. And here is the part that adds insult to injury. An attempt to repair or widen the crack, to stop it from spreading and let the bell ring again, appears to have made things worse rather than better. The effort to fix the bell may have helped finish it off, silencing it more thoroughly than the original damage. It is the classic tale of a repair that becomes the final blow. If you have ever tried to fix something and ended up breaking it more completely, you know this specific flavour of regret. You see a small problem, you decide to address it, you apply your confident solution, and somehow the small problem becomes a large one that can no longer be undone. The Liberty Bell, national treasure, appears to have suffered exactly this indignity. Its famous crack potentially worsened by the very hands trying to save it. So the bell you revere is, Medically speaking, a mess. A history of early cracking, multiple recastings, a famous crack from the 19th century of uncertain precise origin, a repair attempt that may have sealed its fate, conflicting accounts at nearly every turn. It is less a pristine relic and more an elderly patient with a thick and contradictory chart, beloved despite, or perhaps because of, all its damage. And that is somehow perfect. A cracked, repeatedly broken, endlessly mythologized object stands as one of the great symbols of a nation whose founding story is itself cracked, repeatedly revised, and endlessly mythologized. The bell fits the country. Both are more legend than fact, and both are cherished anyway. Which brings us to another beloved figure whose story rests on remarkably thin evidence, the woman said to have sewn the very first flag. The story is charming. A humble seamstress, visited by George Washington himself, stitches the very first American flag in her Philadelphia parlor. It is also almost entirely unverified. There is no solid contemporary evidence that any of it happened. The tale did not emerge publicly until 1870, nearly a century later, and the source was conveniently her own grandson standing before a historical society and telling a lovely family story. It is one of the coziest images in the whole founding mythology. A modest Philadelphia seamstress, needle in hand, receives a visit from none other than George Washington, who asks her to sew the first flag of the new nation. She suggests improvements, stitches the stars and stripes together in her humble parlour, and quietly gives birth to the most recognisable symbol in American life. It is warm, it is domestic, it is perfect, and it rests on almost nothing. When historians go searching for evidence that this actually happened, they find a striking absence. There is no reliable record from the time of Washington commissioning Betsy Ross, no contemporary documentation of her sewing that first flag, nothing solid to anchor the beloved tale to the events it describes. The story is not disproven so much as unsupported, floating free of the kind of evidence that would let anyone confidently call it history rather than legend. The timing of the story's appearance is the real giveaway. The tale did not surface during the Revolution, or in the decades right after, when people who had lived through it were still around to confirm or deny it. It burst into public view in 1870, nearly a full century after the supposed events. For 100 years, the great story of the first flag simply was not part of the national conversation, which is a very long silence for such a charming and important claim. And then there is the source. The person who brought the story forward in 1870 was Betsy Ross's own grandson, who stood before a historical society and recounted the family tale. Now, a grandson sharing a cherished story about his grandmother is a completely human and understandable thing. But as a foundation for national history, it has some obvious weaknesses. It is a family legend, passed down through generations, presented by a descendant with every loving reason to believe and promote it. This is not to say Betsy Ross was not real, because she was, and she was indeed a working flag maker in Philadelphia. The question is only whether the specific, iconic scene, the Washington visit, the first flag, the parlour, actually happened the way the legend says. And the honest answer is that we simply do not have the evidence to know. What we have is a beautiful family story that arrived a century late and swept the nation, because it was exactly the kind of story people wanted to believe. Think of how your own family stories work. There is probably a tale about an ancestor, something dramatic or charming, that gets repeated at gatherings with total confidence. It might be entirely true. It might be embellished. It might be mostly invented by someone 2 generations back who told it well, and once it is in the family canon, questioning it feels almost rude. Now imagine that story escaping the family and becoming a nation's cherished history. That is Betsy Ross. So the seamstress in the parlour may have really done it, or she may be a lovely legend stitched together long after the fact by a proud grandson and an eager public. Either way, the truth is far less certain than the classroom version admits, and the flag itself, first or not, turns out to have been a far less standardised thing than you have been led to believe. Here's another surprise. In the early days, there was no single approved design for the flag. Stars were arranged in circles, rows, and various creative clusters, depending on who was doing the sewing. There was no rule book, no committee of taste, just a general agreement that there should be stars and stripes and a lot of room for personal interpretation. The neat, uniform banner you salute is the result of standardization that came much, much later. You carry a very specific flag in your mind, stars arranged with tidy precision, stripes in perfect order, everything uniform and official, as though it descended from the founding fully formed and exactly regulated. But in the earliest days of the nation, there was no such thing as the single correct flag. There was an idea of a flag, stars and stripes to represent the states and the Union, and beyond that a wide open field of interpretation. The official guidance at the time was remarkably loose. It called for stars and stripes, but it did not lock down how those stars were supposed to be arranged. There was no diagram, no mandated pattern, no committee dictating that the stars must sit in these exact positions. This left an enormous amount of room for whoever was actually making the flag to decide how it should look, and different makers made very different choices. So early flags varied wildly. Some flag makers arranged the stars in a neat circle, others put them in rows, still others clustered them into creative patterns, arranging them however seemed pleasing or practical. Each flag was, in a sense, a small act of personal design. There was no wrong answer because there was no official answer. The result was a delightful patchwork of variation, a whole family of flags that all counted as legitimate. Picture the modern equivalent. Imagine your company announces a new logo but only describes it in vague terms, something like it should have a circle in our name, and then leaves everyone to interpret that however they like. Within weeks you would have 100 wildly different versions floating around, each technically correct, none of them matching. That is essentially how the early American flag existed. A general concept executed 100 different ways by 100 different hands. The crisp uniformity, the one exact official design, came much later through the slow process of standardization. Over time, rules were established, arrangements were fixed, and the flag became the precisely regulated object it is today. But that regulation was a later development, layered onto something that had begun as a loose and creative idea. The neatness is real, but it is not original. It was imposed on top of a much messier and more charming beginning. There is something genuinely lovely in this. The founding flag was not a rigid, top-down symbol handed down with exact specifications. It was an open concept, brought to life by ordinary makers exercising their own judgment and taste. Each early flag carried a little of its maker in it, a personal interpretation of a shared idea. The symbol of unity was, fittingly, made in many hands and many forms before it ever settled into one. So the pristine, standardized banner you salute is the polished end product of a long process, not the starting point. In the beginning there were many flags, all valid, all a bit different, stars scattered according to the whims of whoever held the needle. And with that, we can turn from the myths that shrank under scrutiny to a tradition that actually holds up mostly, though even it comes with a small twist about when the exploding started. The fireworks are the one tradition that actually traces back cleanly, and even that has a twist. Those illuminations John Adams wrote about were real. and the very first organised 4th of July celebration, complete with fireworks, took place in 1777, a year after the fact. So the founders did not celebrate independence by blowing up the sky in 1776. They waited a year, then decided that the correct way to honour a legal document was with controlled explosions. After all the myths that crumbled under inspection, it is a relief to reach a tradition with real roots. The fireworks are legitimate. They connect genuinely to the founding, and specifically to John Adams, who, you will recall, predicted celebrations full of illuminations. He was using the 18th century word for the festive lighting of fires. And yes, fireworks. So when you watch the sky explode each year, you are participating in something Adams actually foresaw, which is a rare win for accuracy in this whole tangled story. But even here, in the one clean tradition, there is a small wrinkle worth savouring. The founders did not mark independence with fireworks in 1776 itself. The night the decision was made, the night of the vote and the approval, did not feature a great pyrotechnic display over Philadelphia. There was too much fear, too much uncertainty, too much treason still fresh in the air for a celebratory light show. The exploding came later. The first genuinely organised 4th of July celebration, the kind with deliberate festivities and fireworks lighting up the sky, took place in 1777, a full year after the event's been celebrated. It was an anniversary party, essentially, held once people had a year of distance and enough of a foothold to justify a proper commemoration. The tradition of blowing up the sky for independence began not on the day itself, but on its first birthday. There is something wonderfully human about waiting a year to throw the party. The moment itself was too raw, too dangerous, too consequential for celebration. But once a year had passed and the thing had held together, once the decision had proven durable enough to commemorate, the people decided the appropriate response was to fire explosives into the air in joyful tribute. Give it 12 months, then celebrate the paperwork with gunpowder. It is a very specific and very endearing kind of logic. And really, think about the tradition on its own terms, because it is genuinely strange when you say it out loud. To honour the anniversary of a written legal document, an announcement of political separation, the nation collectively decided that the ideal method of tribute would be controlled explosions launched into the night sky. Not a moment of silence, not a solemn reading, though there is some of that too. Explosions, colourful, thunderous, slightly dangerous explosions. It is magnificent and completely bizarre. The modern version of this needs no imagination, because you live it every year. A grown adult, responsible and sensible in every other area of life, will drive to a temporary tent in a parking lot, purchase a quantity of explosives from a stranger, transport them home, and then set them off in the driveway in honour of a document approved in 1776. And this is considered not only normal, but deeply patriotic. Adams predicted it. He just could not have predicted the parking lot tent. So the fireworks survive the scrutiny, mostly intact, which after everything else is almost touching. They are real, they were foreseen, and they connect honestly to the founding, with only the small correction that they began a year late. It is the one tradition you can enjoy without a historian wincing beside you. And that theme of things arriving later than you assumed extends even to the holiday's official status, which took an astonishingly long time to become real. You might assume the 4th was sacred from day one. It was not. For decades it was celebrated unevenly, more of a strong local tradition than a national institution. Congress did not make it an official federal holiday until 1870, and it did not become a paid holiday for federal workers until 1938. For a very long time, the birthday of the nation was something you observed on your own time, unpaid, like a book club. Surely you might think the 4th of July was enshrined as a sacred national holiday from the very beginning, treated with official reverence from the moment the ink dried. It was not. For a remarkably long stretch of the country's life, the 4th was celebrated, yes, but in a patchy, uneven, distinctly unofficial way. It was a strong tradition in many places, a big deal in certain towns and cities, but it was not a formally recognised national institution handed down from on high. Different communities marked it differently, or sometimes barely at all, depending on local custom and enthusiasm. There was no federal stamp of approval making it an official day of national observance. It lived and grew as a grassroots tradition, sustained by the people who wanted to celebrate rather than by any government decree. For decades, the nation's birthday was, in a sense, a volunteer effort, kept alive by popular affection rather than official mandate. The formal recognition took an astonishingly long time to arrive. Congress did not designate the 4th of July as an official federal holiday until 1870. Do the arithmetic on that. The events being celebrated happened in 1776, and the holiday marking them was not made federally official until nearly a century later. For close to 100 years, the country celebrated its own founding without that celebration being a formally established federal holiday. And the story gets even better, or worse, depending on how you feel about being paid. Even after 1870, the 4th was not a paid holiday for federal workers. That particular perk did not arrive until 1938. So for well over a century and a half after independence, and for decades even after the holiday became official, celebrating the nation's birthday was something you did on your own time, without compensation, out of pure patriotic goodwill. Let that sink in as a workplace reality. For generations, the 4th of July was essentially an unpaid holiday, a day you might take to celebrate freedom while your wages did not celebrate along with you. The idea that the nation's birthday should come with a paid day off, now taken completely for granted, is a surprisingly modern invention, arriving deep in the 20th century, long after the founders and their children and their grandchildren had all come and gone. It reframes the whole thing, doesn't it? You probably imagine an unbroken chain of grand, official, paid celebrations stretching back to the founding. The reality is a slow, halting climb toward formal recognition, with the holiday spending most of its life as an unofficial, unpaid grassroots tradition that people kept alive simply because they loved it. It was a book club, essentially. A wildly popular, nationwide, deeply patriotic book club that eventually, after a very long time, got official status and later still, a paycheck attached. There is something almost sweeter in that, honestly. The 4th endured not because a government insisted on it, but because people genuinely wanted to celebrate year after year on their own time and their own dime. The affection came first, and the official recognition trailed far behind. And in those early, official years, the way people actually celebrated looked nothing like the family-friendly picnic you picture. It was, to put it gently, considerably rowdier. Forget the wholesome family picnic. Early 4th of July gatherings were loud, boozy affairs built around endless political toasts, where men would stand and raise a glass to liberty, then to the states, then to the militia, then to roughly anything else that came to mind. Cannons were fired, speeches ran long, and a great deal of drinking was involved. It was less a gentle cookout and more a very patriotic bar crawl with artillery. The image you hold of early 4th of July celebrations is probably gentle and wholesome. Families on blankets, children with sparklers, a tidy communal picnic, everything sunny and mild. Scrub that image away. The early celebrations were a rowdier, louder, drunker affair, closer to a raucous festival than a peaceful gathering, and the centerpiece of the whole thing was not the food. It was the toasting. Toasting was practically a competitive sport at these events. Men would rise, glass in hand, and offer a formal toast to liberty. Then someone would toast the states. Then someone would toast the army, or the militia, or a particular general, or the memory of some event, or a foreign ally, or an abstract virtue, and on it went. These were not one or two polite salutes. There could be a long, structured sequence of toasts, each one an occasion to raise a glass and, crucially, to drink. You can see immediately where this leads. A celebration organised around a lengthy series of toasts, each accompanied by drinking, is a celebration engineered for steadily increasing intoxication. By the time the assembled patriots had worked their way through toast to liberty, the states, the militia, and whatever else struck their fancy, a great deal of alcohol had been consumed in the name of national pride. Patriotism and drinking were, on these occasions, essentially the same activity. And then there was the artillery. Because a loud, boozy celebration apparently needed to be louder, cannons were often fired as part of the festivities, booming out over the proceedings and adding a percussive soundtrack to the toasting and the speeches. Combine long-winded oratory, heavy drinking, and the periodic discharge of cannons, and you have an event that was thrilling, chaotic, and just a little bit hazardous, which is a very different vibe from a quiet family cookout. The speeches, too, were their own endurance test. Oratory was a beloved feature of the day, and speakers did not exactly aim for brevity. Long, soaring, elaborate speeches were part of the ritual, delivered to crowds who were, as the toasts accumulated, growing progressively less capable of following a complex argument. Picture a lengthy patriotic address delivered to an audience that has toasted liberty a dozen times over. The commitment on both sides was genuinely impressive. The modern comparison almost undersells it. Imagine the most enthusiastic possible combination of a formal banquet, an open bar, a series of increasingly emotional speeches, and someone firing a cannon in the parking lot every few minutes. That is roughly the energy of an early 4th of July. It was less a gentle observance and more a full-throated, well-lubricated, artillery-punctuated celebration of a young nation, feeling its own existence and getting a bit carried away about it. Honestly, there is something more fitting about that than the tidy picnic version. A brand new country, improbably free, marking its survival with loud, joyful, slightly reckless abandon, raising glass after glass to everything it could think of. The wholesome family gathering came later, once the nation had settled down. In the early years, the 4th was a party with a hangover attached, and the calm, familiar national soundtrack you associate with it all turns out to belong to an entirely different war. Here is one that quietly rearranges your entire mental timeline. The Star-Spangled Banner, the song you struggle to hit the high notes of, has nothing to do with the Revolution or the 4th of July. It was written during the War of 1812, decades later, after a completely separate conflict. So the anthem you associate with the founding was inspired by an event the founders would have considered current events, not history. In your mind, everything patriotic tends to blur together into one glowing era. The declaration, the flag, the fireworks, the anthem, all of it feels like it belongs to the same founding moment, one seamless origin story. So it can genuinely rearrange your sense of time to learn that the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem, the song strained through every ball game and ceremony, has nothing whatsoever to do with the Revolution or the 4th of July. The anthem you know was written during the War of 1812, a completely separate conflict that took place decades after independence was declared. It was inspired by a specific event in that later war, a bombardment endured through a long night, after which the sight of the flag still flying moved a witness to write the words you now know. The song is real, its origin is stirring, and it is simply from a different chapter of history than the one you've been mentally filing it under. Consider the timeline properly. The founding happened in 1776. The War of 1812 happened, as the name helpfully insists, in the 1810s. Those are separated by a span of decades. To the men who declared independence, the events that inspired the anthem would not have been ancient history or sacred founding lore. They would have been recent news, current events, the sort of thing you read about with fresh concern rather than reverent nostalgia. The anthem describes a war that came after the founders' founding work was long done, and it gets even more disorienting because the Star-Spangled Banner was not even made the official national anthem until well into the 20th century in 1931. So not only does the song come from a later war, its formal status as the anthem is more recent still, arriving more than a century after the war that inspired it, and more than a century and a half after independence. The song you treat as timeless and foundational is, in official terms, a relatively modern designation. This is one of those facts that, once you absorb it, makes you look at the whole patriotic bundle differently. The pieces you assumed were all born together in one heroic summer were actually assembled over a very long time, drawn from different eras and different conflicts. The Declaration from 1776, the famous bell legend from the 1840s, the bell's name from the 1830s, the anthem from the 1810s, made official in the 1930s. It is a collage, not a snapshot. Think of how the modern version of this confusion works. You might associate a particular song so strongly with a certain event or era that you assume they came from the same moment, only to discover the song is years older or younger than the thing it soundtracks in your memory. The emotional association is so strong that it overrides the actual chronology. That is exactly what has happened on a national scale with the anthem and the founding. None of this diminishes the song or the moment that produced it. The origin of the Star-Spangled Banner is genuinely dramatic, a flag still standing after a night of bombardment. It simply belongs to a different story than the one you've been telling yourself. And that habit of collapsing separate events into one tidy founding moment runs even deeper, because the famous fighting that supposedly began the fight for independence actually came before independence was ever declared. The dramatic phrase about the shot heard around the world refers to the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which happened in 1775, more than a year before independence was declared. The war, in other words, was already well underway before anyone signed anything. The Declaration did not start the fighting. It was more like a formal announcement issued in the middle of a fight that had already turned very ugly. You probably carry the events in a neat order in your head. First, the colonists declare independence, and then, provoked into war, they take up arms and start fighting for it. Declaration, then battle. Cause, then effect. It is a tidy sequence, and it is backward. The fighting came first. The famous shot heard around the world, the opening gunfire at Lexington and Concord, rang out in 1775, more than a year before anyone stood in a warm room and approved the Declaration. Think about what that means for the whole story. By the time the founders got around to formally declaring independence, blood had already been spilled. Men had already died. The war was not a future consequence of the Declaration. It was a present, ongoing, deadly reality that had been unfolding for over a year. The colonists were not deciding whether to start a fight. They were already deep in one, with casualties mounting and no easy way out. This reframes the Declaration entirely. It was not the spark that ignited the conflict. It was a formal statement issued in the middle of a conflict that was already burning. The men who approved that text were not calmly choosing to begin a war from a position of peace. They were rationalizing, justifying, and making official a break that events on the ground had already forced. The paperwork was catching up to the reality, not creating it. There is a useful modern parallel. Imagine two parties already locked in a bitter, damaging dispute, one that has already caused real harm and shows no sign of stopping. And then, well into that dispute, one side finally issues a formal written statement announcing that the relationship is over. The statement feels like a dramatic turning point, but really it is just putting into official language something that everyone involved already knew was true, because they had been fighting about it for a year. That is the declaration. A formal announcement that named and justified a separation the fighting had already begun to enforce. It gave the war a purpose, a stated cause, a philosophical foundation. It told the world and the colonists themselves what all the bloodshed was actually for. That was no small thing, but it did not fire the first shot. The first shot had been fired long before, and its echo was still hanging in the air when the founders picked up their pens. Why does the myth flip the order? Because it makes for a cleaner story. Declaration, their noble war for freedom, is emotionally satisfying and easy to teach. War already underway, then a document explaining it after the fact is messier and less heroic in its shape. So memory quietly reorders the sequence, putting the inspiring words before the ugly fighting, when in truth the fighting came first and the words came to make sense of it. So when you picture the founders approving the declaration, do not imagine men at peace deciding to risk war. Imagine men already at war, already committed, already past the point of return, formally announcing why. The shot heard round the world had come and gone. The declaration was the explanation that followed. And that leads directly to another assumption the holiday quietly gets wrong, the belief that declaring independence was the same as achieving it. This is the part that always startles people. Declaring independence in 1776 did not make it real. It was a statement of intent, not of victory. The war dragged on brutally for years afterward, and Britain did not formally recognise American independence until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So the moment you celebrate was not the finish line. It was closer to the starting gun, fired by exhausted men who had no idea how long the race would last. Here is a distinction that the fireworks tend to blur. Declaring independence and winning independence are two entirely different things, separated by years of brutal, uncertain, bloody war. The 4th of July celebrates the declaration, the announcement, the statement of intent. It does not celebrate a victory, because in 1776 there was no victory to celebrate. There was only a bold and dangerous claim made by men who had no guarantee it would ever come true. When the founders declared independence, they were not announcing that the war was won or that freedom was secured. They were announcing what they intended to achieve, and then they had to go and actually achieve it against the most powerful military on earth, with no assurance of success. The declaration was a promise made to an uncertain future, a bet placed by people who genuinely did not know whether they would end up free or hanged. And the war that followed was long. It dragged on for years after 1776, grinding through hardship, defeat, near collapse and staggering sacrifice. There were dark stretches when the whole enterprise looked doomed, when independence seemed less like a coming reality and more like a fatal miscalculation. The men who signed that document had to live through all of it, not knowing how it would end, carrying the knowledge that they had put their names to treason. Independence was not formally recognised by Britain until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. 1783. That is 7 years after the date you celebrate. 7 years of war and struggle stood between the declaration and its actual official realisation. The moment you mark with fireworks was not the triumphant conclusion. It was near the very beginning of an ordeal that would last most of a decade before the claim made in 1776 became a recognised fact. So the 4th is not the finish line. It is closer to the starting gun. It is the moment exhausted, frightened, determined men committed themselves to a race whose length and outcome they could not possibly know. Celebrating independence on the 4th of July is a bit like celebrating a marathon at the sound of the starting pistol before a single mile has been run. The hard part, the years of grueling effort, all of that came after. Consider the modern version. You announce a huge, ambitious goal, publicly and irreversibly. You declare your intention with total conviction. But declaring it is the easy part. What follows is years of grinding, uncertain, exhausting work to actually make it real, work that might fail at any point. The declaration was the glamorous moment. The achievement was the long slog nobody puts on a poster. We celebrate the announcement because it is dramatic and quietly skip past the 7 years of struggle that made it true. That, honestly, makes the courage of the moment greater, not lesser. These men declared independence knowing the fight was far from over, knowing the odds were long, knowing the cost could be everything. They fired the starting gun with no promise of a finish. And speaking of the messy reality behind the triumphant image, the idea that the whole country stood united behind that declaration is another comfortable myth that does not survive a closer look. The tidy image of a nation united behind independence does not survive contact with the facts. A large share of colonists remained loyal to Britain, and many others simply tried to stay neutral and keep their heads down. Families were split, neighbours turned on one another, and choosing a side could cost you your home or your life. The 4th was not a party everyone attended. For a great many people living through it, it was a terrifying and deeply divisive gamble. The founding myth loves unity. It presents a colonial population rising as one, universally yearning for freedom, universally behind the cause, a whole people marching together toward independence. The reality was far more fractured and far more human. The colonists were deeply divided about the whole enterprise, and a great many of them did not want independence at all, or were terrified of what pursuing it would cost. A substantial portion of the population remained loyal to Britain. These were not villains or fools. They were people with genuine ties to the crown, real economic interests, sincere beliefs about order and legitimacy, and understandable fears about the chaos of rebellion. To them, declaring independence was not a noble act of freedom. It was reckless, dangerous, possibly ruinous treason against a legitimate government. They wanted to remain British, and they had their reasons. And then there were the many who simply wanted no part of any of it. They were not passionately loyal and not passionately revolutionary. They just wanted to survive, to keep their farms and families and lives intact, to keep their heads down while powerful forces collided around them. Neutrality was its own difficult choice in a conflict that increasingly demanded everyone pick a side, and staying out of it entirely became harder and more dangerous as the war ground on. Because choosing a side, or refusing to, had real and brutal consequences. This was not an abstract political disagreement conducted at comfortable distance. It split families down the middle, turned neighbour against neighbour, and could cost a person their property, their safety, or their life. Loyalists faced persecution, seizure of their homes, and worse. The war was, in many places, a civil war, with all the intimate cruelty that phrase implies, neighbours informing on neighbours, communities tearing themselves apart. So the image of the 4th as a universal celebration, a party the whole country happily attended, is deeply misleading for the people who actually live through it. For enormous numbers of colonists, that summer was not a joyous birth of a nation. It was a source of dread, division, and danger. Some watched independence being declared with genuine horror. Others watched with fear for what it would unleash. It was a gamble that many of them never wanted to make. Picture the modern equivalent. Imagine a decision so enormous and divisive that it fractures your community, splits your family into opposing camps, turns lifelong friends into enemies, and makes staying neutral almost impossible. Some are thrilled, some are horrified, some just want everyone to stop and go back to normal. That was the emotional reality of independence for millions of ordinary people, a world of divided households and dangerous choices, not a unified festival of joy. Understanding this makes the achievement more remarkable, not less. Independence was won not by a perfectly united people, but by a passionate, determined faction that prevailed despite deep internal division, loyalist opposition, and widespread reluctance. The unity came later, forged over time, not present at the start, and that same tension between the ideal and the reality sits at the very heart of the document's most famous and most powerful line. The Declaration proclaimed that all men are created equal, a phrase that still echoes powerfully today. Yet it was written and approved by men who, in many cases, enslaved other human beings. That glaring contradiction was there from the very first day, unresolved and unavoidable. The line that would later inspire generations of movements for freedom was, at the moment it was written, an ideal wrapped around an uncomfortable and enormous exception. We arrive again at the deepest contradiction of the founding, and like the deleted passage earlier, it deserves to be met with honesty rather than a joke. The Declaration contains one of the most powerful sentences ever written, the assertion that all men are created equal. Those words have echoed across centuries. They have inspired movements, toppled injustices, and given language to countless struggles for freedom around the world. They are genuinely magnificent, and they were written and approved by men who in many cases held other human beings in bondage. There is no way to make that sit comfortably, and it should not be made to. The same hands that wrote and approved a ringing declaration of universal human equality also, in many instances, owned enslaved people, treated them as property, and profited from their forced labour. The ideal proclaimed on the page and the reality practiced in the lives of its authors were in direct, glaring, undeniable contradiction. This was not a subtle tension. It was a chasm, and it was there from the very first day. This was not a flaw that crept in later or a failure of subsequent generations. The contradiction was baked into the founding document at the moment of its creation, present in the very act of writing those noble words. The people who declared that all men are created equal were, at that same time, denying the most basic freedoms to a large portion of the population. The gap between the words and the reality opened the instant the ink hit the page. For the enslaved people living through that moment, the phrase "all men are created equal" was not an inspiring ideal. It was a promise made in their hearing and immediately denied to them. The lofty language of freedom did not extend to them, even as it was proclaimed to the world. That is a cruelty of a particular and profound kind, to declare a universal truth while excluding by force the very people standing closest to the Declaration. The words were real, so was the exception, and the exception was enormous. Here is the complicated part, the part that requires holding two things at once. The words were not worthless because their authors failed to live up to them. In fact, the words would go on to become weapons against the very injustice their authors practiced. Later generations, including the enslaved and their descendants, and the movements that fought for their freedom, would seize on that phrase, "all men are created equal," and use it to demand that the nation finally mean what it had said. The ideal outgrew its flawed origins, so the line was both a hypocrisy and a promise. In the moment, it was an ideal wrapped around an unforgivable exception. Over time, it became a standard the nation could be held to. a measuring stick that exposed the distance between its stated values and its actual conduct. The words did not match the reality, and that mismatch became one of the great engines of American history, the long, painful, ongoing effort to close the gap between what was said and what was done. Tonight, hold this one plainly. The founding was capable of articulating an ideal so powerful it would inspire the world, and simultaneously incapable of living up to it. Both are true. The greatness and the failure share a single sentence, and after all these tangled contradictions and corrected myths, history serves up something almost supernatural, a coincidence so precise it feels scripted, involving two of the very men who wrote and argued over these words. Now we get into the genuinely eerie. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two of the central figures of independence, both died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, within hours of each other. Adams reportedly died believing Jefferson still lived. It is the kind of coincidence that, if you put it in a movie, everyone would roll their eyes. And yet it happened, exactly on cue, as if history itself wanted to make a point. After all the debunking, all the myths gently dismantled, we reach a fact so strange that it sounds invented, and yet it is completely, verifiably true. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two of the towering figures of American independence, the man who wrote the Declaration and the man who fiercely championed it, both died on the same day. Not just any day. They died on July 4th, 1826, the exact 50th anniversary of the Declaration they had brought into being. Let the precision of that settle over you. The 50th anniversary. A perfect half-century to the day. Both men, aged and failing, held on through the spring and into that summer, and both let go on the very anniversary of the document that defined their lives. If a novelist proposed this, an editor would strike it out as too neat, too convenient, too obviously manufactured for meaning. History apparently felt no such restraint. It delivered the coincidence in full, without apology. The two men had one of the most complicated relationships in American history. They had been allies in the cause of independence, then bitter political rivals who wounded each other deeply. Then, in their final years, reconciled friends who exchanged long, thoughtful letters across the distance between them. Their bond spanned the entire arc of the founding, from shared revolution to fierce enmity to a hard-won late friendship. And then they died together, in a sense, on the same symbolic day. There is a detail that makes it even more haunting. Adams, in his final hours, reportedly took comfort in the thought that Jefferson still lived, that his old friend and rival carried on. He is said to have spoken of Jefferson near the end, unaware that Jefferson had already died just hours earlier that same day. Adams found peace in the belief that Jefferson endured, not knowing they were slipping away nearly together on the same date, tied to the last by the document and the coincidence. It is the kind of thing that makes even the most rational person pause. Two men so central to the founding, so entangled with each other for half a century, dying within hours on the 50th anniversary of their shared achievement. It resists easy explanation. It feels, against all reason, like something more than chance, like history reaching out to underline its own significance, to place a final punctuation mark on the story of independence exactly 50 years in. Of course, coincidences do happen, and the human mind is drawn to patterns and meaning. Both men were old and ill. Anniversaries can, in ways not fully understood, seem to affect the timing of a failing person's final days. There are rational threads to pull, but even with every rational caveat in place, the sheer precision of it, the same day, the same anniversary, the 50th, the two of them, remains genuinely astonishing. Some facts do not need embellishment to feel like magic. So of all the things in tonight's journey, this one asks for no correction, no debunking, no gentle deflation. It is simply true, and it is simply extraordinary. Two founders, gone on the same symbolic day, one believing the other lived. And if you think the universe was finished making its strange point with two presidents, you will be delighted and slightly unnerved to learn that a third soon joined the pattern. If two founders dying on the same 4th felt like too much, history was not finished. James Monroe, another founding-era president, also died on July 4th, this time in 1831. 3 of the first 5 presidents exited on the same date. On the flip side, Calvin Coolidge was born on the 4th of July. At this point, you have to wonder whether the holiday has developed a strange gravitational pull on the American presidency. Just when you've absorbed the astonishing coincidence of Jefferson and Adams, history leans in and adds another twist, as if daring you not to believe it. James Monroe, another president from the founding generation, also died on the 4th of July. His came a few years later, in 1831, but there it is again, the same date, claiming a third figure from the early republic. The pattern improbably extended itself. Do the tally, and it becomes genuinely eerie. 3 of the first 5 presidents of the United States died on the 4th of July, not scattered across the calendar as you would expect, but clustered on this single date, the date of independence itself. 2 of them on the very same 4th, and a third a few years on. For a date to claim one president is unremarkable. For it to claim 3 of the first 5, the founding-era leaders, starts to feel like the universe developing a very specific habit. Statisticians can explain that coincidences are more common than intuition suggests, that with enough people and enough dates, striking alignments will occur. And that is true, and worth keeping in mind before we start believing the calendar is haunted. But knowing the rational explanation does little to dull the strangeness of the pattern. 3 founding presidents, gone on the anniversary of the document they helped create. The math may account for it, but the feeling it produces is something else entirely. And then, because history apparently enjoys symmetry, there is the other side of the coin. While the 4th of July was busy claiming founding presidents, it also gave one. Calvin Coolidge, who would himself become president, was born on the 4th of July. So the date does not only take, it also delivers. It saw the exit of 3 early presidents and the entrance of a future one, presiding over both the beginnings and the endings of American lives at the highest level of the office. At this point, a reasonable person is entitled to a little superstitious wonder. The 4th of July seems to have developed a peculiar gravitational relationship with the American presidency, pulling deaths and births toward itself with uncanny frequency. It is almost as if the date, so central to the nation's identity, extends its significance into the very lives of those who led it, marking their comings and goings with the same day that marks the country's own origin. Consider how this would land if it were fiction, a story in which the nation's founding date repeatedly claims its founding leaders, taking 3 of the first 5 and then, for balance, produces a future president on the same day. It would be dismissed as heavy-handed symbolism, too on the nose, the kind of thing real life would never actually do. And yet real life did it, without hesitation, stacking coincidence upon coincidence until the pattern became impossible to ignore. So the 4th of July is not merely the birthday of a nation. It is strangely a recurring date in the personal histories of its earliest leaders, a day of both endings and beginnings woven through the presidency itself. Chance, surely, but chance with a flair for the dramatic. And after that detour into the eerie, we return to the more earthly business of correcting the record, starting with the beautiful document everyone pictures, which was itself made after the fact. The beautiful, elegantly handwritten parchment you picture in a sealed glass case was not the version approved on the 4th. That gorgeous engrossed copy was carefully prepared later and signed over the following weeks and months. The document that was actually adopted on July 4th was the plain printed text. So the sacred relic everyone lines up to see is, in a sense, the deluxe edition, produced after the real decision had already been made. Picture the document in your mind. The famous one, the sacred parchment, elegantly handwritten in that flowing script, protected behind glass, gazed at reverently by visitors who line up to see the very object that founded a nation. It is treated as the true artifact, the genuine thing, the physical declaration itself. And here is the small correction. That beautiful handwritten version was not the document approved on the 4th of July. It came afterward. What Congress actually adopted on the 4th was the text, the words themselves, approved as final. And as we established, the first physical copies to go out into the world were the plain printed sheets, the Dunlap broadsides, cranked out overnight by a hard-working printer. There was no gorgeous calligraphy involved in the moment of adoption. There was a vote on wording and a rush to print. The plain practical version was the one that did the actual work on the actual day. The stunning handwritten parchment, the one everyone thinks of, was a later production. It was carefully prepared afterward, hand-lettered in that elegant script onto fine material, created as a formal ceremonial version of the text that had already been approved. This is the copy that was signed over the following weeks and months as delegates trickled in to add their names. It is beautiful, it is historic, and it was made after the decision it represents had already been made. So the sacred relic behind the glass is, in a sense, the deluxe edition, the special printing, the nicely bound commemorative version, produced once the real business was concluded. It is a bit like the difference between the working draft that a decision was actually made from and the gorgeous framed copy hung on the wall afterward to mark the occasion. Both are meaningful, but only one was present at the moment that mattered, and it was not the pretty one. There is a gentle irony in the fact that the object we treat as most authentic and most sacred is, in this sense, the least original. The humble printed sheets came first and carried the news. The elegant parchment came later and carried the ceremony. Yet it is the parchment we enshrine, the parchment we protect, the parchment we line up to revere, precisely because it looks the way a sacred founding document ought to look. Beauty once again wins out over chronology in the story we choose to tell. Consider the modern parallel. A crucial decision at your organisation is made from a plain, functional document, the working version everyone actually used. Later, someone produces a gorgeous framed copy, beautifully designed, to commemorate the moment, and it gets hung in the lobby where everyone admires it. Years on, people point to the framed version as the real thing, forgetting entirely about the plain working copy that actually got the job done. The commemorative edition has quietly replaced the original in everyone's memory. That is the story of the parchment, genuinely historic, genuinely worth preserving, and genuinely made after the fact, a ceremonial rendering of a decision already reached through humbler means. It deserves its glass case. It just does not deserve the assumption that it was there, finished and signed, on the 4th itself. And from a document dressed up grander than its origins, we turn to a founding figure dressed up in a legend far larger than the small private grumble that started it. You've probably heard that Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to be the national bird instead of the eagle. It is a fun story, and it is also exaggerated. Franklin never formally proposed the turkey for anything. He simply griped, in a private letter to his daughter, that the eagle had a bad moral character, and that the turkey was, in his opinion, a more respectable bird. It was a personal grumble, not a policy proposal, quietly transformed over time into a founding legend. This one is a delight, because the myth is so specific and so widely believed. The story goes that Benjamin Franklin, wise and witty founding father, campaigned to make the turkey the national bird of the United States instead of the bald eagle. People repeat it constantly, usually with a chuckle, imagining Franklin standing before his peers earnestly advocating for the turkey while everyone else rolled their eyes. It is a charming image. It is also considerably exaggerated. Here is what actually happened, stripped of the legend. Franklin never formally proposed the turkey as the national bird. He did not stand up in any official setting and argue for it. He did not submit it as a serious suggestion to be voted on. There was no turkey campaign, no lobbying effort, no earnest proposal defeated by eagle enthusiasts. The grand story of Franklin fighting for the turkey simply is not what occurred. The reality was far smaller and far more personal. What Franklin actually did was grumble, privately, in a letter to his daughter. In that letter, he offered his personal opinion that the bald eagle had, in his view, a bad moral character, being the sort of bird that lived by taking from others. And he remarked, by contrast, that the turkey was a more respectable bird, a genuine native of the country, more courageous in its own way. It was a witty, opinionated aside, the kind of thing you might write to a family member to make a wry point, not a formal policy position. That is the whole basis of the legend, a private, somewhat tongue-in-cheek complaint about the eagle's character, shared in family correspondence, expressing a preference for the turkey's virtues. From that modest seed grew the towering myth of Franklin the turkey champion, doing battle for his preferred bird on the national stage. The tiny private grumble was inflated, over time and retelling, into a full-blown founding campaign that never actually took place. You can see exactly how it happened, because it is the same engine that powered the ringing bell and the seamstress and so many others. A small, real, charming detail gets discovered, and because it is fun, it gets repeated. And with each retelling it grows a little, gains a little drama, sharpens into a better story, until the modest truth, a man grousing about a bird in a letter, becomes the grand legend, a founder crusading for the turkey. The good story eats the boring truth, as it always does. Think of your own life. You make an offhand, joking comment to a family member about preferring one thing over another. Years later, that comment has somehow become family law, in which you passionately championed a cause, fought for it, made it your crusade. The original was a shrug and a joke. The legend is an epic. That is precisely what happened to Franklin and his turkey, scaled up into national mythology. So Franklin did have opinions about the eagle and the turkey, and they were genuinely funny and characteristically sharp. He just never proposed the turkey as the national bird in any official way. It was a private quip, not a policy. And with that gentle deflation, we come to one last correction, concerning the very building where so much of this history unfolded, which did not even carry its famous name at the time. The famous building where all of this unfolded, the one now known reverently as Independence Hall, did not have that grand name at the time. Back then it was simply the Pennsylvania State House, a functional government building where men argued, sweated and swatted at insects. The soaring, patriotic name came along much later, once the events inside had been polished into legend. In 1776, it was just the office where the arguing happened. We end our tour of corrections at the building itself, the hallowed hall, the shrine of American independence, the place every schoolchild learns to revere as Independence Hall. It is treated as sacred ground, the very cradle of the nation, and its grand, patriotic name seems as old and permanent as the founding itself. And In keeping with the theme of tonight's journey, that name did not exist when the actual events took place. In 1776, the building was not called Independence Hall. It was the Pennsylvania State House, a plain and functional name for a plain and functional purpose. It was a government building, a place where the business of governing got done, where officials met and debated and handled the ordinary administrative work of the colony. It had no soaring, reverent title. It was quite simply the State House, an office building in every practical sense. Picture what it was actually like inside, stripped of the reverence. Not a gleaming shrine, but a working government building in the sticky heat of a Philadelphia summer. Men crowded into its rooms, arguing fiercely over wording and politics and enormous consequential decisions, sweating through their heavy clothes, swatting at the flies that inevitably found their way in through open windows, exhausted, irritable, and deeply aware of the danger of what they were doing. It was a workplace, not a temple, and it felt like one. The grand name, Independence Hall, came along much later, bestowed once the events that happened inside had been polished by time and memory into legend. As the founding became sacred in the national imagination, the building where it occurred was elevated too, renamed to reflect the weight of what had transpired within its walls. The reverent title was applied in hindsight, retroactive honour placed upon a building that, at the crucial moment, was just the office where the work got done. This is such a fitting note to end our corrections on, because it captures the entire pattern of tonight's journey in a single detail. Nearly everything about the 4th of July that feels grand, permanent and sacred was actually shaped, named and polished after the fact. The bell got its legend from a novelist and its name from abolitionists. The parchment came after the decision. The anthem came from a different war. And the very building got its majestic name once the ordinary rooms inside had been transformed by memory into hallowed ground. The modern parallel is almost too easy. Think of some ordinary place where something significant once happened. A plain room, a normal building, nothing special to look at. And then, once the significance is recognised, the place gets a grand name, a plaque, an air of reverence, until people forget it was ever just an ordinary spot where ordinary work happened. The location did not change. Our story about it did. That is Independence Hall, once just a sweaty office full of arguing men. So the hall you revere was, in the moment that mattered, the Pennsylvania State House, a workplace where nervous, brilliant, deeply human men did something extraordinary in thoroughly ordinary surroundings. The grandeur came later. The work came first. And that gap between the humble reality and the glorious legend brings us, fittingly, to the final and most important question of all, the one that ties this entire tangled story together. After everything we've corrected, why do we still celebrate the 4th at all? After all of this, the wrong date, the delayed signing, the invented bell, the doubtful seamstress, the unfinished war, you might reasonably ask why we bother celebrating the 4th at all. The answer is beautifully simple. The date printed at the top of the document says July 4th, 1776. That is what people saw, that is what they remembered, and that is the day the idea took hold. History is often less about what precisely happened and more about the story we chose to carry forward, and this story, flawed and tangled as it is, was worth carrying. So here we are, at the end of the long unravelling. We have pulled thread after thread, and the tidy tapestry you started with has come apart in your hands. The date is off by 2 days. The signing was scattered across weeks. The bell probably didn't ring, got its name later, and cracked at some uncertain time. The seamstress may be a legend. The war was already underway and dragged on for years. The words did not match the reality. Given all of that, you might reasonably ask why we bother celebrating this particular day at all. The answer is quietly beautiful, and it is this. The date printed at the top of the declaration reads July 4th, 1776. That is the date people saw when they looked at the document. That is the date that got printed and circulated and read. That is the date that lodged in the collective memory and never left. The vote on the 2nd, the signing in August, the reading on the 8th, all of it faded, and the date on the page endured, because that is the date the story attached itself to. And there is something profound in that, something worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep. History, so often, is less about the precise mechanics of what happened, and more about the story a people choose to carry forward. The exact sequence of votes and printings and signatures matters to historians, and it should. But what shapes a nation is the story, the shared memory, the date everyone agrees to gather around. And the story chose the 4th, because that is what was written on the page for all to see. The myths too serve a purpose, even the invented ones. The ringing bell, the seamstress in her parlour, the founders signing together in a beam of golden light. These are not lies so much as the emotional truths a people wrapped around the dry facts to make them meaningful. They express how the founding felt, or how later generations needed it to feel. A nation does not fall asleep to a list of corrected dates. It falls asleep to a story, and the story needs a bell, a flag, a moment of shared courage. None of the corrections we made tonight actually diminish the thing itself. If anything, they enrich it. The founding was messier, slower, more divided, more contradictory, and more human than the poster version admits. Real men, exhausted and frightened, argued in a sweaty statehouse and committed treason over a period of weeks, unsure whether they would end up free or hanged. That is more remarkable than the clean myth, not less. The truth has more courage in it than the legend ever needed. So we celebrate the 4th, because the 4th is the day the idea took hold, the date the story settled on, the anniversary a people chose to carry forward through every generation. It does not matter that the vote was on the 2nd or the reading on the 8th. What matters is that a nation looked at a piece of paper, saw a date, and decided that this would be the day it remembered itself into being. The choice of the day is itself a small act of storytelling, and we have honoured it ever since. And that is worth carrying. Flawed, tangled, half-invented, and gloriously human as it is, the story was worth keeping. Because underneath all the myths and corrections lies something genuinely true. A group of imperfect people, in an imperfect building, on a not quite accurate date, set down an idea so powerful that it outgrew their own failures and became a standard the world still reaches toward. The facts are messy. The idea endures, and that is more than enough reason to light the sky. So there you have it. The 4th of July, unwrapped, unravelled, and gently turned over in the dark. A holiday built on the wrong date, announced by a bell that probably never rang, honoured by a flag whose maker we cannot quite confirm, and sealed by a document most people signed weeks after the fact. We spent tonight pulling threads, and the neat little tapestry from your 3rd grade classroom came apart in our hands, revealing something stranger and softer underneath. And yet, somehow, none of it feels smaller for the unravelling. If anything, it feels more real, because behind every myth we deflated stood actual people. Tired, sweating men in a stuffy statehouse, swatting at flies and arguing over commas, committing treason not in one heroic flash but slowly, deliberately, over long and frightening weeks. A writer sitting quietly wounded while his best lines got crossed out. A printer working through the night so a nation could read the news by morning. A country that could write words more beautiful than it was able to live up to, and then spend generations trying to grow into them. That is the quiet miracle of it. History is rarely as clean as the poster on the wall. It is messy, contradictory, half-remembered, and stitched together from the stories we chose to keep. But the choosing is its own kind of truth. A people looked at a date on a page and decided that this would be the day they remembered themselves into being, and they have carried that story faithfully ever since, fireworks and all. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your soft pillow in your cool, quiet room, with your lights dimmed and your fan humming gently in the dark, maybe let go of needing the story to be perfect. The people who lived it certainly could not. They simply did the best they could with the day they were given and passed it forward to you. Rest easy now. The sky can keep its fireworks until morning.